Hey everyone, Sam and Jonathan here. Welcome back to episode 11 of the newly rebranded Business Therapy podcast by Trueble. Business therapy is where we're creating space to talk about real business problems in an honest way. Before we start today, don't forget to like, subscribe, and leave a comment so you can stay up to date on all of our weekly topics and discussions and everything Trueble. Today, we're going to be talking about business standards. And as always, we like to talk about what is a standard, what does it mean to standardize, and a lot of the noise around this topic, because this is mentioned in a lot of different contexts and a lot of different kind of business scenarios. So as always, I think the first thing to combat is what is a standard and what should we be thinking when somebody says standard? So before I kind of sink into that rabbit hole, Jonathan, do you have anything to add at a high level?
No, as you were starting to say, standardization and standards is the basis of all the hot topics today: digitization, automation, etc. So it's a real fundamental.
And like a lot of things we talk about, it's the less sexy part of all the things that people want, like automation and digitization and process improvement. So it doesn't really get the airtime. It's kind of the nasty part that you feel like you just have to do. And oftentimes people don't talk about it, and then you don't do it, and then it's even more messy and terrible. So let's talk about what it is and why it's so important. The first thing I'd say is framing up what does most business environments look like. If you think about a process that's running in a business, it's a lot of people, especially at scale, trying to do the same thing. But if you don't control that and you're not measuring and monitoring it, there's often a lot of different ways things start to happen. So without being too abstract, if I have a process that's making shoes and I want everyone in the business to make the shoes the same way, but then people start have the flexibility to like maybe do a different step or add a stitch here, or kind of maybe pass it to this person to do some aspect of coloring before it comes back for quality control. Now you may be getting the same outcomes, but everything is being done with a little bit of variation. And that variation is the opposite of standard. So I think it's important to put that in your mind first, which is when we say standard, it's really we're talking about something that's being done the same every time versus something that's being done a little bit different every time. And why do we care about that? Variation in process always adds cost to the process.
Sometimes, though, the variation is a customization that's part of a service or an expectation. So if you're making bespoke clothing, articles, you're not going to aim to standardize or eliminate variation.
Yeah, so that's a great point, and one that I think needs to be clarifying. That's part of the problem. When people think about standards, they think, oh, now we have no flexibility to do anything. So it's good that you brought that up. Standard is sort of uncontrolled. When we talk about variation, we're talking about uncontrolled variation versus planned variation. You could have actually a process that makes, like, say, 15 variations of the same shoe or bespoke clothing, and that could be a standard process. So when we say standard, we're not talking about removing creativity, removing flexibility, removing people's ability to control their situation or process. This is the first thing that I was leading to kind of clumsily, and Jonathan helped me get there, which is people are afraid of standards because of this reason. When people hear standard, they think they're going to lose control or they're not going to be able to have the flexibility to do what they want to do. But that's not what it's about at all.
And it's one of the reasons why standard, Sam said it's the least sexy element of the conversation. It's because it's one of the hardest, because it's a change management nightmare. Because as Sam is saying, people are inherently resistant to losing their character or losing their control. Because if everything is variation in people's heads, for example, then they're critical. The second you standardize, it would seem to reduce the importance of the individual.
Right. And standard, so I was alluding to it, I never really got to it. I think the definition of standard we'd like to impart from a process perspective is a process at whatever level of detail you describe. And that's not fixed. It operates the same way every time. And that doesn't mean, again, it doesn't have to have any flexibility. It just means that when somebody describes a process or observes a process, if it's following a standard, that means it is happening in a prescribed way every time that it happens. And again, that could be with a lot of flexibility built into it, but it has been described, and it doesn't vary uncontrollably or surprisingly from that description. And I think that's where a lot of people, you know, they they don't want to they want to just think about it like from what Jonathan said. You're just losing control, losing your ability to contribute in a I guess ad hoc or flexible way. But that's not always destructive. That's not always constructive. It can be destructive, is what I was trying to articulate. And
Yeah,
let
it's
me see
almost
if that's
never,
okay.
because we're talking about wasteful variation, so
Yep.
unnecessary variation. So it's never constructive. It, to most people, once it's done, it liberates creativity because you're taking the tasks that can be standardized and potentially ultimately automated, and allowing people to now have higher level thought about other opportunities.
Yeah, and that's where I don't want to bring automation into the conversation too early, but you want to get to the point where you're repeating the same things that should be repeatable over and over, so you don't have to think about them anymore, or you can give them to a junior resource, or you can give them to a computer and like program the computer to do them, and like Jonathan said, that actually frees up time to do more creative things, which is why that's what everyone wants to do.
Yeah, it's a critical point. You get tremendous benefit from standards and standardization, even in the absence of automation.
Yeah.
I didn't mean
Well,
to make that jump.
now we're like teasing the whole automation idea, but that's
Well,
one of the things that people want, and that's the point we're trying to make. People want automation, but you're starting to see in the conversation we're having, you can't get there without standardization. They're part of always the same puzzle, I guess you could say, because it's kind of like what we're always saying in our general theme of life, which is unless you start removing waste and creating more opportunity for more creative things, you're never going to get the cool things. You've got to always look to how are you going to create the space and the focus and the opportunity. It's the same with automation, digitization, which is what we started the podcast with, standardization, which is removing all the variation, removing the uncontrolled aspects of a process or a situation, is the first thing you have to do to create that platform, to create that runway, to do the things that we're talking about, all the things that people are trying to achieve.
and just sticking with the definitions for a second, most definitions also include the idea that a standard is a best practice. In fact, sometimes it's used as a synonym, and I'd be very hesitant to say only a best practice is a standard. In fact, as Sam said, you're removing uncontrolled and unnecessary variation. The reason why I say that the best practice shouldn't be part of the definition at first is because you want the ability to start from a baseline. And if that means that it's easier to start from something that is not the perfect state, that's a better place to start than waiting till you have the perfect standard. Because if you wait till the perfect standard, then especially if you're talking about a scenario where there's a lot of uncontrolled variation that has to be analyzed, it could take a very, very long time. But once you have a standard, your ability to iterate is incredible. You can't iterate from variation. You can't iterate from a standard that needs to be improved. That being said, ultimately, the standard should be the best practice. So I don't want to imply either that it's not, the objective.
Well, I think it's a very important point when we're talking about definitions. And this is a lot of what I'd call business therapy, which is giving people control of knowing how to speak to what's going on in their environment. But a standard and a best practice have to be separated, because you can have a standard that's poor. And I think that you can't if you're conflating the two all the time, and you're in a conversation with other people where they're conflating them, it gets very out of control. And you can't really speak effectively about what's going on if one person says standard and means best practice, and another person is talking about standard just because they're trying to get control of something in the immediate sense so they can make changes. They're two different things, and they shouldn't be conflated. Like Jonathan said, you can have a standard that is best practice, but they're not necessarily one and the same.
And it's very dangerous again to start from that perspective, because in many instances, in fact, having an A+ standard for a pass-fail scenario is just pure waste. It'd be like, I should say it's like studying toward getting an A+ in a class that's pass-fail. You need to know why you're doing the standard, and if the why is aligned to a lower level of standard or of analysis to get there, then that's the way to go.
Yeah.
So I don't know if Sam, if I explained that well, but
I think it's good. I mean, it's a complicated topic again, because there's so many things packed around this, and we always start with, okay, we need to talk about the definition, and even we realize, how much noise there is and how you have to kind of separate the pieces. But I think that's absolutely right. I mean, a standard, like a lot of things, people want things to be black and white, and they want them to be directional. But standard is not. It's a neutral term, and we'll talk about in a little bit what it actually means to make a standard. But it's neutral. Like you just said, Jonathan, you have to have an objective and a context, like another principle that we're always espousing. So, like, what's the standard going to be used for?
Because the standard is a solution. It's a solution to a problem. And what ends up happening is a lot of times, when we've seen it in lean and other process improvement areas, everyone just starts fixing everything and trying to standardize everything. And that's a disaster. That is an absolute waste of everybody's energy, because you don't need to improve things that don't result in any benefit. So or at a diminishing return level. So you certainly want to be selective. And when you think about it as a solution to a problem or to achieving something, usually reducing costs, then you're liberated from getting into that scenario where you just start standardizing everything around you.
Yeah, and without going too far off the beaten track, I think you brought up a really good point there about solutions as a standard, or standard as a solution. I mean, that I think is a really insightful thing that you just articulated. And as a if you think about standardizing as a solution, the question is, what are you solutioning? What is the problem you're trying to solve? And I think the one point that Jonathan mentioned in there too, about if you're using standard as a solution to reduce variation and at the same time improve or change the process, that's always a dangerous idea. Like a lot of times when you're doing process work, you never want to be defining sort of your baseline and then simultaneously changing it at the same time, because that never really, it's changing multiple variables at one time. You don't ever really know the result. It tends to be uncontrolled, which is again why knowing what you're doing is so important when you're attempting to quote unquote standardize. But bringing back to the central definition of what a standard is, the solution that it always offers is reducing the uncontrolled or unseen variation in a process. That's sort of, again, the fundamental goal of standardization. And that goal can be, like we said, removing variation so that we can just have a baseline and we can see what's going on, which is requisite to make changes. It could just be so that we can say everything's going in one way. It doesn't mean it has to be the good way or the bad way, but that's sort of a starting point.
Yeah, I mean, it's almost impossible to have any monitoring or risk mitigation for something that doesn't have a standard, because there's nothing to monitor. Or it's across too many dimensions. So,
go ahead. Sorry.
No, please, Sam.
I was saying this is why so many people want it. So if you're the person who is listening and you're the victim of somebody saying, I need this to be standard, and you're feeling attacked because they're removing your autonomy from the process, this is a lot of time why people come to that, which is you can't measure a non-standard process. You can't monitor it. You can't apply data to it. It's basically when management has to finally admit that we have so little measures and controls over what's happening in our business. That's a lot of times when they fall into this, we need to standardize thing, and consultants say it, and most best practice dictates it. But that's part of the reason we're having this podcast. Not a lot of really people, I think, understand the mechanics or why that is or what's the point. But you can't measure something, and you can't start to help something where we don't know what it is. It's again a part of the self-awareness part of, like, one of our, I think, principal tenets, which is if you don't know what you are and you don't know where you are, you're not going to be able to meaningfully change or assess yourself. And that's where a lot of people try to do this.
Or just, using, I think, terms consistent from what we've done in the past. If you don't know your as is, changing it is very dangerous. Or thinking that you have control over it or understand it is foolhardy, because you can't possibly understand something that you don't know what it is. So if you don't know what your current standard is, it's interesting when companies speak about standards, it's usually at a senior level. And I read an article the other day that managers, a certain number of managers were polled about what their teams do. And the highest percentage someone got was like 60% of knowing what the teams do. And this is what we see all the time. The people that are doing the standard or engaged in the activity are the ones that have the most information about it. And trying to impose it from top down without understanding what people are actually doing is very dangerous.
Yeah, and for that reason alone, if you're the person who's doing the things, you want a standard because you can define the standard. How you want to do it can be a standard as long as you and the people on your team who are in that function can agree to it. And then a documented standard is actually your best friend because then when management comes down and asks you to make changes or asks you to do something, you can pull up the standard and say, well, this is how we're doing it today. So the suggestion you're making, it doesn't, make sense. Now, if you want to do it your way, and it's not documented anywhere, and no one can really confirm that's how it's being done every time, or that all your colleagues are aligned, then somebody's going to eventually come to you when things are getting out of control and ask you to make changes. And that's when that's where you're in a dangerous situation and you're going to feel this is out of control. I don't know how this is going to impact everything. I don't know how it's going to impact my whole team, but there's not going to be anything in place to help anyone broker that conversation. And trust me, a lot of business changes are made in that space where there is no standard. No one cares about the standard. And to Jonathan's point, they just very dangerously make changes and then deal with the consequences because we don't really know what's going on.
I'll give you an example of it just occurred to me, a practical standard. If you think about your home, you have a standard for where things go. The plates go somewhere, the forks go somewhere, your medical supplies, everything is somewhere. But imagine if there was no standard. Imagine if people just willy-nilly put it, and maybe you all live with somebody who does, but put it anywhere. Think about how inefficient that is, because every time you're going to check for it, and find where something is, and it's bespoke each time to try and put together your, the accoutrement that you need for your dinner. So that's business. That's the same exact thing that happens in business when people aren't using templates or don't have a standard to which they're working. They're basically just putting things willy-nilly and trying to get through their day. And that's the kind of waste that we're, talking about in the absence. That's on one side of the scale. And the other side of the scale is like ISO standards, where people are certifying that a company is meeting certain standards because it's associated with risk mitigation and following something consistently. What we often see, though, is when you start just standardizing like that too much, and it's documentation across the board, you have a lot of standards and documentation that are completely divorced from what's actually happening in the real world, which is not what's supposed to happen. But that's when you over standardize or over document your standards.
Well, and definitionally, again, what you're bringing in is almost standards with a capital S. So I want to clarify that too, because when you're talking about an ISO standard or like a risk mitigation standard from like a company or a third party, now again, you're talking about this is a standard for a whole industry or marketplace that a third party company has established, and then you can standardize in your company toward that standard with a capital S. Good so point. Again, when we're differentiating, again, this is why this stuff is also confusing. So if somebody says, I want to make this ISO standard, that means you're meeting somebody else's definition of standard. But it could also mean at the same time you're standardizing your own process to remove a lot of the uncontrolled aspects and the variation. And like to Jonathan's point, today we're putting dishes all over the house and expecting dinner to be made on time. Tomorrow we're going to standardize where the dishes go when they're before and after dinner. And that way we always will know that. So there's a lot of aspects to it. But that aspect of having a standard, making standards, it might be a good segue into what does it actually mean to make a standard? So we're talking about a process that you want to make it the same. We want to remove uncontrolled variation. Well, how does one do that? How does one actually define their as is and promote the standard? And I'll start by saying a lot of it is, again, trying to figure out what you're doing today. So if you have your team of 5 clothing makers or shoe makers, and they're all printing out shoes, and you may see as the manager, well, they're all making about 10 shoes a day. But then you interview them all and they're all doing it totally differently. They're all out at their desk to do it however they want. Well, the first thing is you've got to figure out what everyone's doing. Because now you actually have 5 processes.
I would say the first thing is why you want the standard. What generated the interest in having the standard? and then, the next step.
Absolutely. We'll always start with why, which is why are we doing this? Because making something standard is a project. That's one of the points we wanted to convey. So if anyone says like, where's the standard or make a standard, that's not something you do overnight. That's a project. So that would be something you'd want, planning and support and budget sometimes for, because it's actually a pretty big undertaking.
And most times when someone says, where's the standard, inherent in that question is the idea that it could immediately and magically be manifested, in the organization. And that's very dangerous. So like anytime somebody says, where's the standard for X? Or, have you come up with a standard for X? I consider that like when my child says, where's the scissors? Why do you need it? That's my first question, because I'm always afraid with what might happen with it.
Well, and like to finish your point, if the child asked, where are the scissors? And you said, why do you need it? And they give you a good reason, and then you don't have scissors in the house, you can't just craft scissors out of nothing. You would have to go and actually acquire them or build them. Like it's not something you can just conjure out of nowhere, to your point. It is tough. And if there's not a standard in place, like I said, even with a team of 5, and you can abstract, that could be a team of 100, 1,000, and that just magnifies the complexity. But if you've got 5 people who are having the same output and they're all getting there in a different way, to create a standard doesn't mean to write it down on paper. That's not done. To create a standard means that all 5 of those people are going to be aligned to do their process in the same manner and get the same output using the same process. And that's a process improvement project. That's not like somebody just saying, okay, here's the standard, or, our point is just conjuring it up. When we talk about standards, it means that you're making process changes. And I think definitionally, that's definitely something people aren't talking about. And part of the frustration that, a lot of people experience when, they think, oh, we have to start standardizing. And so standardizing, go ahead.
This goes back to what we talked about, a very critical distinction between operations and projects. When you're making a change, and the change can include identifying a standard, even that element, even before you've implemented, that changes things, because you're interviewing people, you're taking people's time, et cetera. That's a project. So any change is you're entering the project zone.
Yeah, for sure. And this one is also not just a project, it's a complicated one that a lot of people really aren't equipped to do. So if you're somebody listening who just thinks like, oh, I should be able to ask my team for a standard process or a best practice standard, that's some serious work. I mean, in the consulting realm, that's a pretty big consulting task, especially if you gave 5 people the leeway to start doing their process how they wanted to. And then 6 months later, you come back and everyone has been allowed to kind of evolve on their own without any sort of continuity or, I guess, association to one another. You could have a lot of variation on your hands. And now you don't know what's happening. And then, it's this example where we're talking about throughout this podcast to say, okay, I want everyone to change step 4 tomorrow because there's a new, market factor, or there's a new compliance regulation. And everyone's looking at each other like, what is your step 4? My step 4 is this, your step 4 is that. There's no step 4 anymore because there's no standard. So what are we talking about?
So like in my example earlier of like putting things away in the house in the same place, if the plates are not in, the second cabinet to the right, because they're all over the place, and I make a presumption that that's where it is, because that's what I think people are actually doing when they're not. And I say, oh, we don't need those anymore. Throw all the things in cabinet 2 out. Meanwhile, it might be cups, it might be, a whole bunch of different things.
Tools.
Exactly. And that's exactly what happens in a real context in business when you try and implement a standard across variation that you don't understand.
Yeah, and that's another thing too. So if you're the victim of somebody has created a standard without talking to you, and now you're supposed to be that's Jonathan's laughing. That's another thing that happens a lot too. So,
well, now we're getting into business therapy.
Yeah. We've decided as upper managers that this will be the new standard, and then everyone has to execute it. And there's no transition plan for all the variation or all the differences or all the custom processes. Then it is the whole, I'm just throwing tools in the trash, even though the standard told me to throw cups in the trash or plates in the trash, and nobody knows what's going on. And that's just a big mess. And wherever you are,
go. And it, on one level, it could be harmless. So I don't know if anyone ever saw Office Space, I think was the movie, the TPS reports, like there's a whole bunch of things that people are just doing because they're told to do that make no sense. And it just, they don't understand the why. And it's just all these protocols and rules, and that's not the objective of a standard, that shouldn't be. But then on the other side of it is when you try implementing a standard and you're relying on that for whatever. Let's say you're implementing a standard because there was some major quality problem, and now you need to address it, and you're putting in a standard and you don't understand it. You're going to have either total failure in implementing it or partial failure, but you're definitely not going to get over the hump of a transition state to implementation if you don't understand your current state very, very well.
Agreed. And also, just to tie a lot of what we've been, we're always kind of out with all these different concepts, but like the TPS reports example, that could be an example of a bad standard. It's a standard that somebody imposed that's not helping the organization, but it's still a single way, theoretically, that everyone might be doing this particular report. And in that, what it is, and it is standard, and there are benefits of being standard because at least we know what is happening. Now we could have everyone doing it and it's not helping, and that's a different dimension. And that's what the dimensions you have to divorce when you think about standards. They're not good, they're not bad, they're the same, which has its own pros and cons.
The reason why I generally always will say like a TPS report, and I guess I need to know what that was very specifically. The reason why I'm always nervous about that is because knowing that standards is such a change management challenge, not being selective in what your standard, where you're creating standards and standardizing, you're generally going to start building resistance to when you actually need to do standards for benefit, for actual beneficial purposes. So that's what makes me nervous about the TPS report.
Yeah, well, generally, there's so much confusion about this, but it is a project, getting back to that vein, and if you're meant to be doing it, you have to know the target process that's supposed to be standardized and figure out first what all is happening. So whether it's going towards a good end or a bad end, you're not going to get anywhere. A standard is not even possible until you know what the activity is, which is gathering up all the variation going on within a certain process, and then getting everyone to agree on changing their behavior so it aligns to one variation, one particular standard. Not I keep trying to avoid using the name in the definition, but that's it's one of those words. That's why it's
Pretty
hard to get your
elemental.
head around.
Distilling down the steps to implementing a standard, I would say the first is aligning it within your project portfolio, within all the other activity, because there's a chance that other activity that's going on that you might not be aware of may obviate the need for the standard. So let's say you're standardizing an email template of some sort. Meanwhile, the company's moving that whole process over to a mobile app that's going to have notifications and emails going away. That's you need to know the context and all the other activity that's going on before you can absolutely say that this is a good idea to do. And then, okay, now you've identified a standard. It has a why. You definitely should be doing it. Then the next day, you need to understand your as is, your current state, which you probably should have done when you were identifying the standard, but you need to understand it very, very well, just like in any other project. You need to understand, well, the standard is the to be, that's your solution, but how it's going to live in your operations, that's also part of the to be. And then you need a transition plan to get there. How is everyone going to adopt it? How much is this going to cost? There's usually a thought, especially when the standard is around standardization of a process that will lead to efficiency. There's usually a thought that it's free. This is going to improve things, so there's no cost to this. But any change equals cost, always. So, and then you implement the transition plan, and then you monitor and see if you're getting the results that you want. So I don't know, Sam, what do you think of that?
I think that's right, and that's the template for all of the way we would say think about projects or changes, which is as is, transition to be. I mean, this is where we've got to equip ourselves so that when people are asking these things of us, we know what's coming. And the standards one is just a subset of that, where people are particularly confused about what they're asking for. And it is a project, and I really like the tagline: a standard is a solution. So if somebody tells you to produce a solution, your question should always be, to what problem? What are we trying to solve? And again, standards should always be attempting to solve variation. because variation always equals cost. Like the more something is varied in an organization uncontrollably, then you can't move it easily, you can't monitor it, you can't, plan for it, and that causes costs in organizations. Now, most of the time when people are asking for standards, you have to be asking these questions because they a lot of times don't see what we're describing. They might want to do it for a number of reasons, and there might be better solutions to get what they want. It's the same problem as always where people lead with solutions. So the idea is you don't want to be leading with solutions. You all want to be agreed on a problem before you start acting. But standards is one of those tricky ones that, since people don't see a standard as a solution, they don't see it as a project, they just try to impose it on you and other people by basically just saying, do what I say and do it all the same way. That doesn't happen. That would be like saying, hey, go ahead and start using a whole new system and rechange your staff because I say. Like, we all have some awareness that that's not productive, but this is that exact same thing. It's just like somebody's telling you, do this whole project and you have no support, and just get it done and prove to me it's done. I mean, it's not viable.
And, just looping back to what I said earlier about the idea of going for an A+ when a pass fail will do, when you think of the standard as a solution and it being going from your current state to your to be state, your costs and your effort are always about the delta between where you are now and where you want to go. So the more detailed the standard, and the more rigorous the standard is that you're trying to implement, the greater the delta is going to be from your current state of variation. And if you don't need to get that detailed, if you don't need that rigor in that standard, you're just adding extra cost. So that if I explain that simply or complicated, but
as always in therapy, we're trying to take very complex issues and try to make them more understandable. But it's always going to be
the therapeutic element, and maybe we, on this note, we can kind of start closing this this part of standards out. But the therapeutic element is, if standards and your company's attempt to standardize is making you nuts, well, it's complicated and it can go wrong in a lot of ways. So you're right for feeling, that it's crazy.
Agreed. And, take a breath and think about it. A lot of times we're helping ourselves out by having these conversations, but it is always more complicated than you think. And you know what? A lot of times in life, people want to think it's more simple than it appears to be. And that's just never reality most of the time in business. There's always a lot of different factors. But yeah, so I think this is a good stopping point, because I know this can be a bit of a heavy topic, but I think we still should talk about, maybe next week, we'll talk about how it does help with the sexy things, how it does help with digitization, how it does help with automation. Why is standards a project that nobody wants to talk about, no one wants to do, that needs to be done to get the good things? And I think that's a whole topic in and of itself. So until next week, thanks for joining us, and we'll talk to you soon.